This program is supported by Northern Cement Max Plus, Supreme at Max Pro Northern Cement, Ahon, Bangon, Sulong, and SMC Global Power.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. The WHO warned that rich countries cannot use boosters to escape the coronavirus. President Duterte said some government projects would be among the sources of the 10 billion peso he pledged to raise for Typhoon Odette victims. The death toll from Malaysia's worst floods in years rose to 37 today as the cleanup operation gathered pace and residents assessed the damage unleashed by the disaster. And images taken by a policeman show officers rescuing two babies from the rubble left by a tornado that whirled through the U.S. state of Kentucky just under 2 weeks ago. The WHO warned Wednesday that rich countries cannot use boosters to escape the coronavirus. WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus reminded reporters that the vast majority of hospitalizations and deaths due to COVID-19 are in unvaccinated people and not unboosted people. Take a look.
While some countries are now rolling out blanket booster programs, only half of WHO's member states have been able to reach the target of vaccinating 40% of their populations by the end of the year because of distortions in global supply. SAGE concluded that the focus of immunization must remain on decreasing deaths and severe disease, and expressed concern that blanket booster programs will exacerbate vaccine inequity. About 20% of all vaccine doses administered every day are currently being given as boosters or additional doses. Blanket booster programs are likely to prolong the pandemic rather than ending it by diverting supply to countries that already have high levels of vaccination coverage, giving the virus more opportunity to spread and mutate. It's important to remember that the vast majority of hospitalizations and deaths are in unvaccinated people, not unboosted people. And we must be very clear that the vaccines we have remain effective against both the Delta and Omicron variants.
What we are learning about Omicron is certainly we have this increased transmission, but the information on severity is still uncertain. We don't have that complete picture yet, and it is too early to conclude whether or not Omicron is less severe than Delta or is as severe as Delta. Now, we do have some data suggesting that rates of hospitalization are lower, some information that people who are hospitalized don't need as much oxygen or invasive ventilation. But again, we have not seen this variant circulate for long enough in populations around the world, certainly in vulnerable populations. We did learn some information this week that Omicron, as it enters older age groups, older people with Omicron tend to have more severe disease. That's unsurprising. We know people have died from Omicron. It's too early to conclude.
The latest data suggests Omicron does not cause more severe illness than previous variants, including Delta. But as soaring infection numbers threaten to overwhelm health systems, scientists warn it could still cause more deaths. France on Wednesday opened vaccinations to children aged between 5 and 11. warning that daily infection rates could hit 100,000 by the end of the year, up from a weekly average of 54,000 daily cases. Europe is currently battling to rein in the spread of the highly mutated Omicron variant of the coronavirus, believed to be much more infectious, and EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen has warned the new strain could be dominant in Europe by mid-January. A number of countries have already opened up their immunization drives to younger children, even though the EU's health agency has warned that jabs alone will not be sufficient to stop the variant's rise. Meanwhile, here in the country, Food and Drug Administration Director General Eric Domingo said the government has issued an emergency use authorization, or EUA, for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine against the coronavirus disease to be used among children aged 5 years to 11 years. In a televised public briefing, Domingo noted that the EUA is being granted today. Let's listen in.
So ito pong produkto niya ito ay nakalagay po siya, ang Pfizer po, minsan iba-ibang brand po, no? Meron pong Tiananmen, depende po kung saan bansa magagaling, or yung pong Comirnaty. Hindi po siya kapareho noong dosage nung binibigay sa adult. Ito po ay mas mababang dosage at hindi lamang po yon, yung concentration din po ng vaccine ay mas mababa din po, no? Kaysa dun sa ginagamit sa adults ngayon. So yung pong bakuna na ginagamit sa mga adults at saka sa 12 to 17, 12 pataas, ay hindi po yon ang gagamitin sa mga bata. And knowing this, actually last week pa po, sinabihan na namin, no, ang ating task force, sila Secretary Galvez at ang Department of Health Secretary Duque, na ibang vaccine po itong gagamitin ng 5 to 11 sa mga bata. So they will have to order and procure this separately. Yun pong mga present doses po natin na nandito ngayon ay pang-adults po yon at maaaring gamitin sa 12 to 17. Pero sa 5 to 11, ibang bakuna po yung gagamitin.
The government has yet to schedule the vaccination of children aged 5 years to 11 years against COVID-19. The inoculation of children aged 12 years to 17 years began in late October, while the administration of booster shots for fully vaccinated adults began the first week of December. Meanwhile, British pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca said that a third or booster dose of its COVID-19 vaccine, the Vaxzevria, significantly lifted antibody levels against the Omicron variant. More from Aribel Celestino, joining us live from the UK Bureau. Hello, Aribel.
Hi, Alma, and yes, British pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca said Thursday that a third or booster dose of its COVID-19 vaccine, Vaxzevria, significantly lifted antibody levels against the Omicron strain in a laboratory study. The threat of the highly transmissible Omicron variant looms large over the festive holidays, forcing many governments to roll out new curbs and urge citizens to get vaccinated. However, separate UK research on Thursday suggested that Omicron infections are less likely to result in hospitalization compared to the Delta variant. Levels of neutralizing antibodies were also higher with the booster jab than with individuals who had previously been infected and recovered naturally. Well, Alma, the study was conducted by investigators from the University of Oxford, which is the academic institution which helped AstraZeneca develop the vaccine last year. Researchers analyzed blood samples taken from individuals infected with COVID-19, those vaccinated with 2 doses plus a booster, and those who had reported previous infections. Mene Pangalos, AstraZeneca's Executive Vice President of Biopharmaceuticals Research and Development, said that the study should boost confidence in the extra jab. On Wednesday, the World Health Organization issued a stark warning to rich countries over boosters, arguing that they divert valuable jabs away from poorer nations and encourage the virus crisis to worsen. The latest data showed Omicron does not cause more severe illness than previous variants, including Delta, but as soaring infection numbers threaten the overwhelmed health system, scientists warn it could cause more deaths. That's it from me, Alma. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Aribel, for that report. Good news indeed, and you take care. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today, Alma. Reporting from the United Kingdom, I am Aribel Celestino, and we live in interesting times.
The United States, meanwhile, on Wednesday authorized Pfizer's anti-COVID pill for high-risk people aged 12 and up as a surge of cases driven by the highly infectious Omicron variant threatened holiday plans and Americans struggle to find tests. Paxlovid, which comprises two types of tablet, was granted an emergency use authorization by the FDA after a clinical trial showed it reduces the risk of hospitalizations and deaths among at-risk by 88%. The U.S. has spent $5.3 billion in procuring 10 million courses of the treatment, with the first 265,000 to be delivered in January and the rest by late summer, according to White House COVID response coordinator Jeff Zients. Now, the FDA stressed the treatment should complement rather than replace vaccines, which remain the frontline tool against the coronavirus. But pills that are available at pharmacies are likely to be much easier to access than synthetic antibody treatments, which require infusions administered by drip at hospitals or specialized centers. Meanwhile, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, or BMA, has decided to cancel the official New Year countdown event due to concerns over the Omicron variant. The cancellation, authorities said, is in line with the World Health Organization's appeal for the cancellation of New Year festive activities worldwide. The Center for COVID-19 Situation Administration, or CCSA, said, however, that activities being organized by the private sector, such as the countdown events at Central World and Icon Siam shopping malls, which have already been approved by the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, will depend on their management for a decision on whether to proceed. He said that should the CCSA said should the celebrations proceed, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration will seek their cooperation in limiting the number of attendees and in enhancing safety measures to reduce the risk of infections. Meanwhile, Russia just passed the grim milestone of 300,000 dead, according to an AFP tally from official sources, making it the fourth worst hit country in the world. Like many countries, Russia has struggled to get its COVID infections under control, an effort that has been hampered by widespread vaccine hesitancy. Less than 50% of the country's 146 million people have been fully vaccinated so far, even though Russia was the first in the world to approve and release a coronavirus vaccine a year ago. As of December 23 today, Russia has reported 10.2 million cases, 300,000 deaths, according to the National Coronavirus Information Center. Meanwhile, China cracked down on the latest outbreak of the virus, shutting down a whole city. On Thursday, China locked down the northern city of Xi'an, home to the world-famous terracotta warriors, recalling the sequestering of the central city of Wuhan in January 2020 when the virus first emerged. Omicron has not been reported in Xi'an, and only dozens of the less infectious Delta cases have been detected in the city of 13 million people in recent days. But the Chinese government, scrambling to maintain its zero-COVID strategy ahead of the Winter Olympics, reacted with typical forcefulness and ordered all residents to stay indoors. Only one person per household can leave home every 2 days to buy their necessities, while non-essential businesses are closed. Meanwhile, China said there is a high probability of COVID-19 outbreaks inside the Winter Olympics bubble. Now, let's listen in.
特别是奥密克戎等变异毒株的传播，给全球疫情带来了极大的不确定性。 冬奥赛时将有大量不同国家和地区的涉奥人员来华，人流聚集增加，出现一定数量的阳性病例将成为大概率的事件。
China, where COVID-19 was first detected, has slowed new cases to a trickle, implementing a strict zero-COVID strategy involving tight border restrictions, targeted lockdowns, lengthy quarantines, and population tracing technology. Even a single case can lead to a swift imposition of curbs, and officials deemed to have failed at controlling COVID-19 are often sacked. Hosting a high number of foreigners for the Winter Olympics remains a high-risk endeavor for China's leaders. In addition to mandatory vaccinations before landing in China, all athletes and personnel inside the bubble must undergo daily virus testing and health monitoring. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that he will not hesitate to take more restrictive measures to curb the spread of the Omicron variant. Here's Patricia Rodriguez for the report. Patricia.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson defied pressure on Monday to tighten coronavirus rules during the holidays to curb surging Omicron cases, but vowed to keep the situation under constant review. The embattled leader, who is reeling from weeks of crisis over various scandals and is facing mounting disquiet within his ruling Conservative Party, said the possibility of taking further action remained. However, after a cabinet meeting, Johnson said ministers had decided not to limit social interactions over the imminent festive period, despite the government's scientific advisors urging such action. Britain reported another 91,743 cases on Monday as the new variant rages, with the highest number of infections in London, where hospitalization rates are also climbing. Daily case rates have repeatedly broken records over the last week as a country, one of Europe's worst hit by the virus, with more than 147,000 deaths during the pandemic, struggles to contain Omicron. Let's listen in.
Clearer. We agreed that we should keep the data from now on under constant review, keep following it hour by hour. And unfortunately, I must say to people, we will have to reserve the possibility of taking further action to protect the public and to protect public health, to protect our NHS. And we won't hesitate to take that action. But in the meantime, what I would say to everybody is please exercise caution as you go about your lives. Please think of the guidance and think of protecting yourself and your loved ones. And please get a booster. Please get a vaccination. There are still some things that we need to be clearer about before we decide to go further, Anushka. But I've got to say to the British public, and I say to everybody, we will not exclude going further if we have to do things to protect the public. Those were people at work. Those were meetings of people at work talking about, this is where I live and it's where I work. Those were meetings of people at work talking about work. And I really think it's vital that we focus, if we can, on the messages we're trying to get across today.
The government earlier this month restored its so-called Plan B, which is the mandatory wearing of masks in various settings, working from home if possible, and COVID passes for large events, to try to stem the surge. Boris Johnson, who was forced into introducing curbs on indoor mixing last Christmas, is facing intense political pressure not to do the same this time around. There has also been public anger at claims that Johnson and his staff broke social distancing rules in place last year by holding parties at Downing Street and other government departments. Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I'm Patricia Rodriguez. We live in interesting times.
And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Northern Cement.
Ahon! Bangon! Sulong!
Pinalaki ng Northern Cement ang kapasidad ng kanilang planta para steady ang supply ng sementong tigasin. Northern Cement Max Plus, Supreme at Max Pro.
Ahon! Bangon! Sulong!
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa new era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Welcome back. Hong Kong Soldiers University launched an overnight operation today to dismantle and remove a statue commemorating those killed in Beijing's Tiananmen Square in the latest blow to academic freedoms as China cracks down. Let's take a look.
係唔該，唔該，係唔好意思，唔該，繼續。
Meanwhile, the artist Jens Galchiot, creator of the Pillar of the Shame statue, reacted to its dismantlement overnight by authorities in Hong Kong. The sculpture commemorating the events of Tiananmen Square, the artist decried the taking down of that statue. Let's listen in.
This is really brutal way to do that. I'm quite shocked to do that because we have tried to be nice and say, okay, we want to pick it up without problem. And then they do this kind of thing. This is a brutal way to do that. Maybe this is a symbol of what China is now. But it's the same brutal way that they try to kill the democracy movement. They put even I think you can get in jail if we put a candlelight to memory about Tiananmen crackdown in a moment. So the China press or the Hong Kong system is more and more like inside China, maybe more and more in the Xinjiang province. So even it's even worse in Hong Kong, I think, is in mainland China now. So I think it's the way they have done that is a symbol of what and how they treat the population of Hong Kong.
Its presence was a vivid illustration of Hong Kong's freedoms compared to the Chinese mainland, where the events at Tiananmen are heavily censored. But Beijing is currently remolding Hong Kong in its own authoritarian image after democracy protests 2 years ago, and commemorating Tiananmen has become effectively illegal. In October, HKU officials ordered the removal of the sculpture, citing new but unspecified legal risks. They made good on that promise in the early hours of Thursday morning. President Duterte and Senator Bongo visited typhoon-hit Siargao. The president visited the victims, gave out food and cash, and promised house repairs affected by Super Typhoon Rai, locally named Odette. Let's listen in.
Ang gobyerno dapat lang unahon ang mga pobre. Kana pagka makita mo na misery and agony, makikita mo na ang taong nakatindig. Yung dito in tatter. Tapos sinasabi lang na pagkain, tubig. Ang sinasabi ko, basta yung kalamidad, earthquake, landslide, sunog, ang unang pangayoon anak sa tao, tubig. Niya sunod pagkaon.
The president vowed to provide 10 billion pesos to assist typhoon-hit areas. At least 19 people in Siargao Island were killed, while 1,000 tourists were stranded. President Duterte has declared a state of calamity in the typhoon-affected areas, where at least 375 people were killed, freeing up funds for relief efforts and giving local officials power to control prices. The damage caused by Rai has been likened to Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. Siargao, Dinagat, Mindanao, and Bohol Islands are among the most devastated by the latest storm. Which tore off roofs, shredded wooden buildings, felled concrete power poles, and even uprooted trees. President Duterte also said some government projects would be among the sources of the 10 billion pesos he pledged to raise for Typhoon Odette victims. Let's listen in.
Kaning kuan na ay kwartang akong nakita. Gabi sige magtrabaho kay kanang mga proyekto sa gobyerno gipangkaltasan ako. Unya na ako'y ikahatag para lang ni sa dili ni infrastructure. Apel siguro matagaan mo tag 50,000 ang usa.
Tuupod mo? Pila, 40 mil siguro sakto na na.
On Monday, he pledged to provide 10 billion pesos in disaster response fund in a speech in Cabanc City, Negros Occidental. Acting Budget Secretary Tina Rose Canda earlier said at least 6 billion pesos of the 10 billion response fund would come from the proposed 5.024 trillion national budget for 2022. The president also assured that help is on its way, but appealed for a little time to lay out where the government would be sourcing the money he pledged, as funds have been depleted by the pandemic. The president also visited the typhoon-hit Dinagat Islands on Wednesday. He previously visited Maasin, Leyte, Inabanga Hotel, or Bohol, Inabanga Bohol, Argao, Cebu, and Cabanc City, Negros Occidental to distribute relief assistance to those displaced by the typhoon. And now we go to the U.S. to take a look at these images taken by a policeman showing officers rescuing 2 babies from the rubble left by a tornado that whirled through the U.S. state of Kentucky just under 2 weeks ago. Take a look.
Hey, hang on. Before you go, hang on.
This footage was filmed on December 10, but was only recently released. According to airport from the ABC 7 NY grandmother Clara Lutz, telling WFIE-TV that she put the 15-month-old Caden and 3-month-old Dallas in the bathtub last Friday with a blanket, a pillow, and a Bible. And then the house in Hopkins County started shaking. The bathtub was found in her yard upside down and the babies were underneath. Authorities from the sheriff's office drove to the end of her driveway and reunited her with the 2 children. Dallas had a big bump on the back of his head and had to go to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Nashville, because his brain was bleeding, but the bleeding stopped before Lutz got to the hospital.
Hang on.
Meanwhile, the death toll from Malaysia's worst floods in years rose to 37 today as a cleanup operation gathered pace and residents assessed the damage unleashed by the disaster. Days of torrential rain caused rivers to overflow at the weekend, swamping cities, cutting off major roads, and forcing tens of thousands of people to flee their homes. Selangor, Malaysia's most densely populated and wealthiest state, encircling the capital Kuala Lumpur, has been one of the worst hit areas. Many in its flood-hit state capital, Shah Alam, were left stranded in their homes with barely any food for days before being evacuated on boats in a chaotic rescue operation. Bloomberg reports that authorities have been criticized by the public and lawmakers for their slow response, with some people trapped by floodwaters for more than 2 days before being rescued, particularly in Selangor, the country's wealthiest and most populous region. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, acknowledged weaknesses in coordinating the response by federal security agencies. According to a broadcast on state-run news channel Bernama TV, floodwaters have been slowly receding, and authorities said the process would speed up after a broken sluice gate, which controls the flow of water into a nearby river, was repaired. Meanwhile, the death toll from a landslide at an illegal jade mine in northern Myanmar rose to 4 today, according to rescuers, warning that the dozens still missing are likely dead. Scores die each year working in the country's lucrative but poorly regulated jade trade, which sees low-paid migrant workers scrape out gems highly coveted in neighboring China. Rescuers pulled 3 bodies from the nearby lake in Pakan Township near the Chinese border today, adding to the one found the previous day. Authorities had initially said at least 70 people were feared missing after the torrent of rocks and earth swept into the lake early Wednesday, but later said that they were still trying to confirm that figure. 2 of the men found Thursday come from Myanmar Pin, hundreds of kilometers away in central Myanmar, they said, while the third was from Rakhine State in the southwest. The miners at Pakan come from across Myanmar to scratch a living picking through the piles of waste left by industrial mining firms in hopes of finding an overlooked hunk of jade. And the U.S. Navy has seized 1,400 AK-47 rifles and ammunition from a fishing boat it claimed was smuggling weapons from Iran to Houthi rebels in war-torn Yemen. U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, or NAVCENT, said it boarded the boat on December 20 in the North Arabian Sea, seized the weapons cache and 5 crew members who identified themselves as Yemeni before scuttling the vessel. Yemen has been racked by civil war since 2014, pitting Iran-backed Houthi rebels against the internationally recognized government. The U.S., as well as allies Saudi Arabia, which is leading the military coalition backing the Yemeni government against the rebels, have long accused Iran of supplying the Houthi with weapons, a charge Tehran denies. The UN estimates Yemen's war will have claimed 377,000 lives by the end of the year through both direct and indirect impacts. And mourners attend the funeral of Zane Mellor, the first service to be held for the victims of Jumping Castle tragedy, which killed 6 children in Australia last week. Family and friends gathered at the memorial service to remember the 12-year-old who was among those killed at primary school in Devonport. 4 boys and 2 girls aged between 11 and 12 died after a gust of wind blew a bouncy castle into the air at a celebration to mark the end of the school year. 2 other children remain in critical condition in hospital in the state capital, Hobart, while 1 child is recovering at home. President Vladimir Putin said today that Washington's willingness to discuss Russia's security proposals aimed at curbing NATO's eastward expansion was positive as fears mount in the West over a major military escalation in Ukraine. The Kremlin has grown increasingly insistent that the West and NATO are encroaching dangerously close to Russia's borders. Take a look.
Хотел бы подчеркнуть, что в целом мы видим пока положительную реакцию. Значит, и американские партнеры нам говорят о том, что они готовы к началу этой дискуссии, этих переговоров в самом начале года в Женеве.
Moscow presented the West with sweeping security demands last week, saying NATO must not admit new members and barring the U.S. from establishing new bases in former Soviet countries. Washington responded that it is willing to discuss the security proposals, but disagrees with part of them and insists European allies must be part of the talks. President Putin said Washington is ready for talks at the start of next year in Geneva, adding that representatives from both sides have been appointed. The growing tensions peaked this week when President Putin vowed that Russia would take appropriate retaliatory military steps in response to what he called the West's aggressive stance. He also announced a new arsenal of hypersonic missiles that he has previously described as invincible, were nearing combat readiness. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be back with the business news right after this.
Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation?
Pag-break na daw po si Martin sa atin.
Kainan, hindi ko kailangan makita kasi maalala na kita.
Nanakaw doon! Bilisan mo! Pulis! Pulis!
Saan ang tumakbo?
Bakit mo pinipigilan?
Ang ganda mo kasi.
Ang inyong pinakabagong gag show.
Dito sa Net25!
Walang iba kundi ang Quezon City!
Welcome back. The EU Economy Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni outlined planned tougher rules on shell companies, along details of its implementation of an international agreement to impose a minimum 15% tax on big multinationals. Take a look.
The new rules will establish transparency standards around the use of shell entities so that their abuse can more easily be detected by tax authorities. Our proposal will help national tax authorities detect entities that exist merely on paper. First, is the bulk of the company's income passive? Second, are a majority of its transactions cross-border? And third, are its management and employees outsourced? If the answer is yes to these questions, the company will be subject to new tax reporting obligations related to economic substance. Minimum taxation will bring additional revenue to EU member states that have seen their tax takes depleted by low-tax jurisdictions. In the medium term, part of this additional revenue will likely decrease as low-tax third countries will increase their tax rates precisely because of the effective mechanism of this Pillar 2.
The plan needs final approval from the European Parliament and all 27 EU member states, coming into force with a target date of the start of 2024. It consists of 3 benchmarks looking at a company's passive income, whether most of its transactions are cross-border, and if its management and administration is outsourced. If all those boxes are ticked, the firm would be considered a shell company subject to new tax reporting obligations and unable to benefit from tax breaks. Also, one EU country could require another EU country to carry out a tax audit of a firm with shell company characteristics. Those characteristics include indications that a company gets more than 3/4 of its global revenue elsewhere than from its business activity, or if more than 3/4 of its assets are in expensive property or high-value dividends. The European Commission at the same time presented its proposed legislative text to impose a 15% minimum tax on corporations as worked out between OECD countries and then approved by the G20. The EU intends to be the first jurisdiction to implement the agreement, and the text provides common rules to be applied by all 27 nations in the bloc. Meanwhile, Finland's long-delayed Olkiluoto 3 nuclear reactor was started up on Tuesday. Operator TVO said, marking the first entry into service of a nuclear plant in Europe for almost 15 years. The EPR reactor, built by the French-led Areva Siemens consortium on Finland's southwest coast, has been started up 12 years later than its initial scheduled completion date of 2009. TVO called the startup historical as the first commissioning of a nuclear reactor in Finland for 40 years and the first in Europe since Romania's Cernavoda Unit 2 was brought online in 2007. The plant will be connected to Finland's national grid in January, with regular energy production expected in June 2022. At 1,650 megawatts, it will become Europe's most powerful reactor, supplying 14% of the Nordic countries' energy. The French-developed EPR reactor model was designed to relaunch nuclear power after the Chernobyl catastrophe of 1986 and was touted as offering higher power and better safety. But EPR builds in Finland, France, and the UK have been plagued by delays and cost overruns. Hinkley Point in southwest England is currently scheduled to begin electricity production in mid-2026, a decade later than first planned. In Dubai, a restaurant at the Expo 2020 has closed temporarily after 10 employees tested positive for COVID, and as the UAE Wednesday recorded its highest number of infections in 3 months. The UAE, with the world's highest vaccination rates, has seen a surge in cases in recent weeks amid increased fears over the spread of the Omicron variant. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry told AFP that 10 workers at the Sushiro restaurant linked to the Japanese Japanese pavilion had tested positive for COVID. The restaurant was undergoing deep cleaning and sanitization after a number of staff were found to be infected, the Japanese pavilion had said in a statement on Tuesday. The reopening of Sushiro will be announced in due course. The UAE, which comprises 7 emirates, including Dubai, on Wednesday, recorded 665 coronavirus cases, the highest number of infections since September 11. The Expo 2020 said in a statement on Wednesday it was doubling down on its commitment to continue hosting an exceptional and safe World Expo. Expo has so far recorded more than 7 million visits since opening on October 1, although some close contact events such as parades and roving entertainers have been temporarily suspended as a short-term precautionary measure. Meanwhile, German national carrier Lufthansa canceled several transatlantic flights around the holidays after the number of pilots calling in sick was greater than the normal for this time a year, according to a spokesman. Take a look. Asked whether the absences were linked to the new Omicron variant of the coronavirus, the spokesman said he could not speculate as he didn't have any information about the causes of illness. In total, the airline has been forced to axe 6 flights between December 23 and 26, including services to Chicago, Boston, and Washington. The lack of personnel came despite Lufthansa's being planned reserves of crew. The airline industry has been battered since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, with countless flights grounded in 2020 as countries closed their borders. An annual gala where honorary Oscars are handed out became the latest glitzy Hollywood event, postponed Wednesday as fears grow of a surge in cases fueled by the Omicron variant. Actor Samuel L. Jackson and Danny Glover, Norway's Liv Ullmann, and actress-director Elaine May had been due to receive golden statuettes to honor their careers next month at an event that typically draws a who's who of Tinseltown. We have made the difficult decision to change our plans in hosting the Governor's Awards in person on January 15, that according to the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences in a statement. It added, given the uncertainties around the variants and the impact this could have on our community, we feel this is the best and safest decision for our honorees and guests. The Academy said, quote, rescheduled plans will come at a later date for this season's Governor's Awards. The main Oscar ceremony is still currently set to take place on March 27. And finally in our news, Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa urged the world's elites to visit space to give them a new perspective of Earth, speaking after his own voyage to the ISS. Take a look.
地球を大事にしようと思いました。慣れるまでにやっぱり3、4日かかるじゃないですか。で、慣れてからもだから8日とかしか入れなかったってことなんで、慣れてからもうちょい痛かったです。だから理想的に言うと20日ぐらい入れたら嬉しかったなって思います。けど30日は長い。偉い方々がですね、宇宙に行っていただいて、宇宙から地球を見ると多分お考えもいろいろ変わられるかもしれませんので、たくさんの方々に宇宙にできれば行ってほしいです。特に国を動かすような偉い皆様に。
Together with assistant Yozo Hirano and cosmonaut Alexander Misrakin, Maezawa spent 12 days aboard the ISS, where they made videos documenting daily life in space for his 1 million YouTube subscribers. The trio blasted off earlier this month in a Soyuz spacecraft operated by Russia's space agency Roscosmos. They returned on Monday and are undergoing a reconditioning period as they get used to being back in gravity. Maezawa, 46, said 12 days wasn't enough time on the ISS because it takes some time to adapt to the environment. The billionaire's next dream is to take 8 people with him on a 2023 mission around the moon operated by Elon Musk's SpaceX. Maezawa and Hirano are the first private Japanese citizens to visit space since journalist Toyohiro Akiyama traveled to the MIR station in 1990. Their return from space caps a banner year that many have seen as a turning point for private space travel. Billionaires Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson all made breakthrough commercial tourism flights this year, bursting into a market Russia is hoping to dominate. And some observers have criticized Branson and Bezos for investing billions in space projects that are more entertainment rather than science.
Being extracted from the Soyuz following his first space flight.
And that's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you all for joining us. As I always say, at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times. Good night.
This program is supported by Northern Cement Max Plus, Supreme at Max Pro Northern Cement, Ahon, Bangon, Sulong, and SMC Global Power.